right, so this is videos we're going to cover map reading and finding the right map. So we're going to talk a little bit about map options first, because I think this is a good place to start. We live in a time where we have many different types of maps available to us, and really, what's interesting with the use and commonplace of Google Maps, we have the ability to get a map anywhere in the world for free. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons and using some of the different maps and kind of how to approach your maps to get you kind of set straight. Now, certainly using a cell phone or a tablet in the woods for map reading actually does work. You can download maps so they're not online. Your battery might, last for a day or two, and if you're just out for a day hike, you could probably use a map, digital map, fairly effectively. In fact, if you're in a city area or you're even in the woods in some cases, or on a trail, it's going to give you kind of an estimated trail or a path that you can walk, say on Street View, for example, and directions that you can use to walk and kind of get comfortable with map reading. I think far too often we rely too much on the digital maps. In fact, map reading skills is something that is going away with younger generations, like how to use a rotary cell phone. So learning how to read a map, I think, is a fundamental skill. And before we can get to that point, we have to figure out what are the pros and cons of the different maps that we have available. So certainly a paper map is going to be our best bet for many different applications. One is it doesn't run out of batteries. Two is it's not going to affect the magnetization of a handheld compass. Okay, so yes, there are built-in compasses in the phones and in our GPSs, and using our maps and our GPSs. It's just another tool. So we'll get into when that's appropriate to use. So in the intro, one of the previous videos, we talked about the recommendation of a state map. One of the first things that you want to think about is how far are you planning on traveling, and what you're actually the ground in which you're actually traveling on, and that is going to dictate the type of map that's going to be best for you. So a state map designed for driving covers a lot of territory, an entire state, so it's not going to have a lot of detail. So the distance from like a point here to point here is going to be quite great, and it's not going to give you any information on this journey. So if this is, let's say, 50 miles, I don't know what it is, I'm just, if this is a 50-mile stretch, that could take multiple days or 2 days or so of walking, and it's not really going to give you a whole lot of information, some kind of gross large-scale information, which is fine from a planning perspective, perhaps, or getting to that trailhead, certainly. But once you're hiking, once you're off out of the car, this map then becomes very limited. And so a lot of times people recommend having a map and compass and say that generally, and then they recommend a state map, oftentimes because these are free and you can pick them up at waysides. So that's just lazy. And it's not helpful. So the other types of maps that people use are Google Maps, and they're great. I do it myself, but you need to be careful about what you're, how you're printing off the maps, the colors that are being printed off, for example, and the paper that you're printing it off on. So one of the disadvantages of Google Maps is that you're going to have many smaller maps. So if you get a proper USGS map, which we'll talk about in a second, you've got a lot more territory covered with just as much detail, if not sometimes less. But you're carrying one map versus many smaller maps that you have to basically manage. So one of the trends that I've noticed in the bushcraft community is carrying maps with large scale on there. And that certainly is helpful, especially if you are a person who is not venturing off very far. But carrying a map with a very high scale is going to be means that you're going to have to carry more maps to cover territory. So for example, I could walk this stretch on this map in about 15, maybe 20 minutes. So by the time I get to the end of this map, I'm going to have to pull out another map, and then another map, and then another map if I want to continue on. So for bushcraft purposes, perhaps when you're not moving about, having a higher degree of detail is nice. Sometimes having more detail when you're learning is also quite nice too. So being able to kind of zoom in, to use that terminology, or zoom out and see a map that's kind of more generalized and see a larger area. Another type of map that is very common can be a nice cross between the state map and, say, like a USGS topographical map, are these gazetteers. These are atlas gazetteers that cover an entire state. Each page is fairly large and can give you some pretty decent detail. The intent of these gazetteers primarily is to give you some more detail on off-roads or minor roads in country areas. And it can give you also a little bit of topography as well, which we'll talk about in a later video. So you can use this for limited use in an off-road or cross-country aspect. It's going to give you a little bit more. Where it's going to be more helpful is really kind of a large-scale look of an area over, the entirety of a journey that you wanted to cross, especially if you're going to be on the roads. So from a survival standpoint or a bug-out scenario, emergency scenario, these are super handy. They're also very handy for fishing, for hunting somewhat, and finding locations that are kind of off the beaten path. So it's a helpful map, but it's bulky, it's big. You would have to cut out each page if you wanted to use this, and again, it's going to give you limited information. So another style of map would be kind of what I'll call a special purpose map, and that's going to be a map that's made by a local agency, whether it be a county or a state park or a national park or even a private concession. And those maps are going to vary in price and capacity and detail. So we could have something very basic like this, which basically just kind of gives you the outline of a trail, or just kind of rough trail, but doesn't really give you much information other than some geographical features, such as a lake, where the boundaries are, where spur trails are, parking, and rivers. So kind of give you some reference. The idea behind a map like this is basically, if you're going to be staying on the trail, it gives you an idea of how long that trail is. You'll stay on the trail. You're not really going to do anything cross-country. So you're very limited. Similar to that would be like a bike trail map, where it highlights a trail that you'll stay on, no different than a canoe trail or a hiking trail, really. Gives you a very limited view of features and things beyond where you're going to be at on your trail. So very focused on staying on the trail and giving you the right information that you need for staying on that trail. Okay, so again, this could be also functional in cross-country use if you adapt the map. So, and you know the limitations. Another map here, this is very similar to the first map. The special use maps, let's just say, gives you a little color, no topography. It's on kind of a linen, thicker paper, so it's a little bit more robust. And it's designed specifically for backpacking, where you're going across country. In this particular area, it's actually not that necessary to have topography, as the land is fairly flat and you're in a wooded area. So it really doesn't give you any kind of advantage, that much of an advantage. Certainly it does, but for most people's case, they just want to know how far each campground is from parking spots and where lakes are and so forth. So it gives you enough information at a good scale. Another type of map would be kind of like the National Geographic map. These are very similar to USGS topographical maps. It's going to give you a little bit more color, different colors, rather. These maps are made waterproof, good sturdy paper. There's two features on these maps that make them a little bit different than other maps. One is they're shaded for relief, so that you have, if you're not familiar with reading a topographical map, it gives you a better idea of how to read the topography, how to read the land around you to orient yourself, so that you can kind of see what's a hill, what's a ridge, what's a peak is going to look like. The second thing that this map is going to do is it has grid north already arranged in it. That grid north is offset by your declination. So your grid north and your declination are the same, or one and the same, meaning that you can use any compass without having to adjust that compass for the deviation between true north and magnetic north. And we'll talk about what that means in a later video. This map also has your UTM grid lines already in it, so that you can pinpoint your exact location. Say someone gives you GPS coordinates on where to go, you can actually locate that and put a little pin or a mark on your map of where that's at. Or alternatively, if you got lost and you needed to radio help to, say, search and rescue or a friend, you can give them you can find your exact locations very quickly and be able to relay those coordinates, and then they'll be able to find you more rapidly. So that's another advantage of these maps. They cost more, but you get those additional features. Another private kind of design map for wilderness use are, like this is a boundary waters map, so it's designed for canoeing, designed for wilderness travel in the boundary waters. So it's going to give you your boundaries. It's going to give you, what lakes you can allow motors. Tells you where your campsites are. Some topography for people that are backpacking or day hiking. But the focus here is on that wilderness area. So you get all the detail in bounds. You leave that boundary into Canada, for example, and you get kind of some very basic information. Nothing as robust as what you would get here. It doesn't have all the fancy, grid coordination. It doesn't have a lot of the same features, although it does have a different type of grid that's numbered on here so that you can relay where you're at within these smaller grid areas. Say a search party needed to find you, or you're looking for a particular map or a lake, campsite or a lake within that grid. So we'll talk in more detail about what this grid means and why later when we get into map use. So certainly the kind of, I don't say gold standard, but the main map that people use and refer to when they're hiking quite often is the USGS topographical map. And this is kind of the standard maps because it's a good scale and size. It gives you enough area to cover over the course of a day, but also gives you enough detail and topography so that you can decipher what's going on in the land around you. These maps come in two different scales predominantly. There's a 7.5 minute map, which is it's basically when we talk about UTM coordinates and longitude and latitude, that we'll talk about the difference between these minutes and how that's judged. But essentially, the 7.5 minutes is the span of the quadrangle that this map is going to represent, and so it doesn't have to do with 7.5 minutes of walking, for example. And I think, and so this is pretty much a standard. The other scale that's often used is a 15-minute map, which is basically for older areas, less developed areas, or less traveled areas sometimes. So anything that's before, I think it's 1960s, and around that time frame prior to, has an older style map that's not going to be as updated. Everything past then is going to be pretty much in this 7.5 minute map scale, which is 1 in 2,400 thousandths. So one, and again, it's going to be very, very helpful. Now, when you're first learning how to read a map and people are using this as your basis to learn how to read a map, it's not very helpful, because in order to get a map like this, you have to go online and either download it, the PDF that you can do for free, or order these maps and have them sent to you, and of a particular area. And oftentimes it's more helpful to have a map that's covers an area that's closer to you than it is just to order out like a wilderness map, a map that's used for wilderness context. So for our purposes, we're going to first learn our basic map reading skills, not on the USGS topographical map, which is great for wilderness use. We're going to use it on a basic city map. This is a tourist town, and many tourist towns have, touristy maps so you can get around and know where things are at. This is the map that we're going to learn how to read on.